good day. I hope your day is as beautiful as ours is here in Spokane. It is amazing. You know, one thing I've learned over the years is that human beings were meaning makers. We're the only creature that makes meanings, and we make them big time. But what does meaning mean? What does that actually mean? How do we talk about it? I mean, if I talk about, like, I mean to help him if I can, or the passage of this bill will mean the end of the, or how about, once again, life has meaning for me. And what is the meaning of this? Keep off the grass. This means you. To look at that face means trouble. Procrastinate means to put things off. Well, there's a whole lot of ways to talk about this meaning. What we're going to do is talk about this last piece, what things mean and how they come to mean that. But we're going to show you that it's a bottomless thing that we're talking about. Meaning. How you doing, Mary Anne?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day.
It is awesome. There is no way to get to the bottom of meaning. It's really a matter of how deep we go. So today we're going to just swim around there at the deep end, because even when we narrow our conversation and discussion to what meaning means in this sense of how things are designated, and it's not just things but ideas, many of these uses, they just go on and on. So what we're talking about today is philosophy, phenomenology, which is part of philosophy. That has to do with the way consciousness and an object are of one's experience are put together. Think about all of this. Think about the words that we're talking about. We can come up with how do children learn the meanings of words? How are meanings in a given language interrelated? What causes words to change their meanings over time? That's a really good one, isn't it? What are the best ways to of setting out the meanings of various kinds of words? How are different meanings, how should they be listed? For example, what the word run means. Do proper names have meanings? How many kinds of meanings are there? Is it clear that none of these questions can be investigated unless one is working with some concept that's implicit to this? We have to know the meaning of meaning, and the fact is, and this is a good thing to understand, again, it's bottomless. There's no way to get to the bottom of it. What we're doing is talking about the Alpha and Omega, the great round of the human mystery, and how we generate that communications within ourselves and with each other. So,
and when we think we mean the same thing when we say a word, and we really don't, that leads to a whole lot of miscommunication.
And what we're going to try to do today is not give you a clear understanding of the meaning of meaning, but to talk about the anatomy of meaning, if you will. Like the best we can do here is give you a few constructs of understanding of how meaning works in our lives. And that, of course, is talking about one of the what are called understandings of meaning in philosophy, which has to do with pragmatics. Okay, so how do we talk about this? What we can say with real clarity is that humans are meaning makers. There is no way for humans to live without meaning. You know, other animals have instincts. We have these meanings, and we've talked about how those meanings cluster, like the meaning of mother and all our experiences of mother. That clusters into this archetypal complex called mother. So we've really addressed meaning in some way of how it roots us to our own consciousness, if you will. But it's important to understand that these complexes, these meanings we create, are really taking the place of the instincts in other animals that they're born and it's all pre-programmed.
Well, and meaning can be fluid, and that's something too that, like using the mother archetype for an example, as a person grows and experiences things, the only experience they have is their own mother when they're growing up. And so the mother has this image, but then as they gain more experience in the world, then your definition of mother can broaden as you meet other mothers and more mothers and see that not all experiences are the same as yours.
That's right. And we begin to cluster those other things
Right.
that modulate our own experience, so that maybe we learn that all mothers aren't cruel and mean because
Right.
our mother may have been. So when we talk about the anatomy, and you can go online and Google the stuff under linguistics or philosophy, but let's look at a couple different reference. In philosophy, there's what's called pragmatics. There is a linguistic context and a situational context. This pragmatics basically says that we have to understand, like you said, Mary Anne, the underlying assumptions, almost the history of another person to get what their understanding of a word is, and to know that they're communicating. That's why I think when we find people we can communicate with, it's such a delight that our meanings line up.
Right.
So there's the pragmatics of meaning, and then there's what's called semantic meanings. Now this gets into facial expression, body language, and tone. You can follow my tone, but you can't really follow the other aspects of my semantics, if you will. Those are the signs of the language that are being expressed along with it. And then, of course, there's conceptual meaning. Language allows information to be conveyed even when specific words used are not known to the reader or listener. People can connect with words, You can see this if you're ever travel to another country.
Right.
And your languages don't line up.
But somehow you figure out how to communicate.
And that's what happens. I remember in a camp I worked with when the boat people from Vietnam were coming in, and there was this one young boy who told me his whole story, and he maybe knew 20 words of English, and I got the whole thing. He was acting it out. It was pretty cool. So when we go to philosophy of language, you get into a whole other way of seeing language and meaning. And of course, we're not new to do this. These are things that were puzzling to Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and if you go to the Taoist literature, oh my gosh, meaning is elusive. As a matter of fact, if you're sure of meaning, that's probably ain't it.
Well, in philosophy, there are tomes and pages and pages and pages on meaning.
And that doesn't mean an apple stops being an apple. There are certain meanings that are designator, they're signifiers of things, of very clear objects.
But is an apple delicious, or is an apple have a worm in it, or is it poisoned, or is it, so an apple is an apple, but then there's more meaning beyond that.
That's right, and you can kind of delineate those layers of meaning. And so let's talk about some of those layers. Again, when you get into linguistics and the philosophy of language, you get into a whole concept called meaning and truth. Oh, truth, boy, that's a slippery thing, isn't it? And basically, there are 5 main theories or that are substantive that are kind of running around in this field. And once we talk about truth, we're talking about another field called epistemology, and that's the study of knowledge, and that's how you distinguish belief and opinion from what is true and true knowledge. And of course, we've talked about some of that before. And part of what I want to do here is for all of you to understand that there is nothing we can touch. There is no thread that when we tug on that is rooted at the deep side of life, it always ends up in mystery. And towards the end of this podcast, I hope I can lay out a little bit of a motive behind what Mary Anne and I are doing here. But what are the 5 substantive? And I want to just lay these out, and they correspond a little bit with what I was talking about earlier. Correspondence theory is basically what I just talked about. Every word corresponds to something in the world, and we can draw those threads, and they're very clear. Again, apple, orange, grass. We all have some clear understanding. Maybe if you work with somebody who's a farmer and grows wheat, when you say grass, they might have a different view than I do of my front yard, and it's needing to get mowed, and me feeling a little sigh in my soul. Although I have to say, as I get older, I'm enjoying mowing my grass more.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yes.
So a second one is called the coherence theory, and that's basically the assessment of meaning and truth requires a proper fit of all the elements within the whole system. This gets back to context. Everything has to cohere to a specific context and fit. I've used the word tzedakah as a Jewish word. When you get your engine tuned and it's just perfect, it's peak performance, that's tzedakah. When in the environment, when we finally are living in accord with everything and we're not polluting and putting any toxic stuff in it, that's tzedakah. But that's also coherence in the sense. And then there's the constructivist theory of meaning. And this is something I hope to give you some understanding. When I said, we can't really solve this, but I hope today we can give you some understanding of how meaning works. I hope we can give you a construct that you can hang the mystery of meaning on and do the dance with it, because that's what it is. I mean, you can't live without meaning. Can any of us?
If we don't come up with some meaning, it's going to be imposed upon us.
That's right. And we've talked about myth as a meaning system. And each of us have our own myth of our own being. And we talked about psyche last week and this totality of being. So we're creating these meanings all the time. And prayerfully, we're letting go of some meanings. I always say the growing edge of faith means sacrificing one's own beliefs many times, because you got to give up beliefs to grow to the next level, and it's a scary level because you don't know what it is.
And sometimes I don't know that we're completely conscious of the meanings that we're operating on, and I guess that goes to beliefs. That there are these underlying things that we're not really aware of why we're doing things, but it goes back to what we have put meaning on or where we've placed our beliefs.
Yes. And that's, the fact is each of us right now are able to take the next breath, to have some dignity, to do our jobs, to do our lives because of the meanings we have constructed or have bought into. And the whole key here, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment, the theological perspective refers to meaning not as a multivalent thing, although it does say that, but it goes deeper yet and says there's a problem of meaning. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. A fourth understanding or substantive theory of meaning and truth is the consensus theory. And, of course, this is kind of a subset that takes more than one person for this to happen. But, we're seeing now that is truth really whatever you say it is? I mean, I'm reading Madeleine Albright's Fascism, A Warning, and I'll be honest, I have never read a scarier book. And I read a lot of horror and sci-fi and stuff, and I'm going, holy moly, we are in deep doo-doo here. So there's the consensus theory, but it also says that if true meaning has to have something, you do have to have consensus.
Well, and on a very simple, everyday experiential level, a red light means stop. And if we don't all agree on that,
exactly,
there's chaos.
So consensus is important, but again, there's in each of these, there's a skew that can really screw us over. And it has, because anything that can happen is going to happen. It's just the way that nature's set up. So the fifth theory we've talked about a little bit. It's the pragmatic theory, and that's basically that it was introduced in the 20th century by people like William James, who I love, although he was a scoundrel, John Dewey, and a number of others. But they hold that the common meaning and truth are verified and confirmed by the results of putting one's concepts into practice. And this is important for us to understand. So here's the piece that happens with these meanings and with theologians, and I'm going to basically Reinhold Niebuhr on this, because I love Niebuhr. He's a brilliant man, and I recommend anything from him. But he talks about what it really is idolatry. That once we have meanings, what happens is we try to take these little finite contingent elements of our existence and then lift them into the divine and call them divine. And then we want to hang them there, because if we do, it justifies and comforts our life where it is. And it allows us to hold on to that which is really moving and cannot be held on to. You can hold on to nouns, but not a verb, and we are verbs.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Kind of what?
Well, in idolatry, you can see it really well in dogmas, for instance.
Okay.
That God is the center of the universe. God, is more magician. The universe is only 6,000 years old.
And it's here to serve us.
And
personally.
it's here to serve us. It's okay to use up the earth. That's part of what God's plan is probably about. And so what you get is we take a piece of a meaning and we freeze it in time and don't allow it to be transformed in such a way. When I was young, you could literally throw a match in the Ohio River and the river would burn.
I remember those days.
And at the early stages of the environmental movement, the question was, can we clean up a river? Is it possible? Once we've done this, can we clean it up? Well, yeah, we can. We've shown that we can. And so new meanings have emerged from that. And we're understanding how those meanings and the transformation of them is integral if we're going to survive and if we're going to heal the planet, much less be part of the healing ourselves.
Got it.
So this idolatry is really part of the bane of our human existence and what holds us back. And we're seeing a huge piece of it now with the American flag, for instance, that it's very, very difficult for us to for some of us patriots to understand how the flag, which represents free speech, the free speech is being squashed by limiting people's response to honoring the flag. And it's this syndrome that occurs within us that causes us to constrict our soul. And we've talked about constriction in the word anger, angst, anxiety. All of those words are part of this constriction that happens. So the whole concept of meaning is one we need to hang on to, but we need to make sure we hang loosely. And that doesn't mean that we hang loosely to the truth, because truth and meaning are feeding back on each other in a way that is totally amazing in my mind.
Well, and truth, I think there's choice here. And I think that, when we decide that we want the truth, then it shapes what meaning we give to things.
Yeah. And that's the pursuit. I believe it was Carl Jung who said, or some wise man who said, if you are given two fruits, truth and the reaching for truth, which should you choose? And it's always the reaching for truth in order to honor the truth. And so it's a self-serving loop of how we honor this process that we're a part of that's trying to uncover the reality of the mystery. Not that we're going to have it figured out,
but that it's always growing, that there's another
Yes.
level, there's another layer.
and that we can learn to dance with it. And now we're close to what matters most to me. Because the mystery of being a human being is both overwhelming and also the coolest thing ever. And I mean overwhelming. I mean, seriously, I feel some days I can crawl to the edge of all meaning and look over the precipice, and it scares the living bejesus out of me. I mean, it really comes down to, why is there anything? And when you start chasing that one down at its fine lines, holy moly, it is overwhelming. It's just, can any of us take it? And then I just scoot back a little and go, holy moly, is that the most amazing thing in the whole world? And then epiphanies rain down like manna from heaven.
Oh, and they're just so satisfying.
So here's what we're really about here. See, this podcast is a discussion about how to live in a respectful relationship with the great mystery that causes us, rather than to make and try to make everything concrete, and to therefore limit its potential, to somehow understand there's a powerful tool that we have access to as our basic, deepest nature, to take the next step, not to limit it, but to, even in the anxiety, if you will, the seeming constriction of taking the next step, to be blown open into a new transcendent state of understanding. That's called epiphany.
And we get there, I think part of that is through our imagination.
Our imagination.
And that if we can image that, then we can go there.
And I don't want to dive too deep into the imagination, because that's where we're going next podcast. The imagination is a faculty that is far beyond anything we can imagine. Did I just say that right, or at all?
Just run in a circle there.
Yeah, I'm chasing my own ass in smaller and smaller circles, that's for sure. So, Mary Anne, do you have any, this has not been a long podcast, but the whole concept of meaning, again, the point I really want everybody to understand, and again, we just tried to lay out an anatomy of meaning to show that if you even touch this, it will shoot to infinity. And you're in a house of mirrors, and there's no wall that is not mirror. And therefore, we're just so caught up in our own reflections that it's very difficult to sort it out. And even when we try to sort it out, what we get is a multivalent. That means the whole meaning of meaning it has so many meanings to it itself.
Well, and I think part of finding meaning is we have to recognize that is something that we find now. And it's the whole idea of constructing meaning. It's just every single moment can hold meaning, but then that next moment can change that previous meaning. And in my own experience, what I found was, when I thought I found meaning, I came to realize that the meaning I found was what I needed to get me to the next place. And I used to visualize it as holding on to a vine and grabbing that meaning and holding on for dear life so I didn't fall, knowing that I have created this meaning, that I have put my spin on this, and that, but always being open to that next vine and grabbing the next one and building on that meaning. And when things and the whole idea was to be okay with the mystery of it, with never really coming up with the ultimate, but knowing that as we create the meaning in our lives, it enables us to live and to live with integrity. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And again, this is what phenomenology is about. It's really about how consciousness and objects are drawn together through this phenomenon of meaning making. And humans have been doing that since the very beginning. And I think, your point, Mary Anne, is beautifully taken, that our totality of being is trying to offer us the next order of meaning. And these orders are one couched within the other. I look at my own understanding and the meaning of God from when I was a child, when I was sure the steeple was there because that's where they took the collection afterwards, because it was kind of like a way station for God to get the money. I was told about 5 years old, I think, that was not what the steeple was for. It was to have a bell that would call people to services. So the meanings change.
Right.
And again, Paul talks about this even in one of his letters about, when you're a child, you see as a child. And how do we mature in our view? For those who still see the universe as 6,000 years old, I point to them to Cassiopeia and say, well, how, that's over 6,500 light years away, so it would take that light 6,500 years to get here. How can you see that? And then they would go, well, God can create all this, and there's all these tricks. She said, one person I talked to, like the dinosaur bones. So I said, so those are God's trick on us? And she went, yeah. So God is the kind of being that when you ask for bread, he gives you stone. And she didn't understand what I was saying, but it has to do with truth. It has to do with our beliefs, and now we're at epistemology and how we come to know what is true. And now, this field of science and philosophy, all of them connect up. They're all coming from the same totality of being. All your questions, and then look at all the things that put a human being on the moon. They're all from the same source that's happening in you.
And logic is a part of that. Logic is a huge part of philosophy, and
there would be no science without it.
Right.
1 + 1 is 2. If you're at a 4-way stop, someone had to come up with a rule to sort that one out. I wish more people would know that rule, by the way. The person on the right has the right of way.
I thought it was the person on the left.
Maybe in Europe, I don't know. But now we're at the point of where meaning comes into play. That place that holds us together, and how important it is for all of us to somehow participate in this place of meaning, of consensus. So, Mary Anne, do you have any final comments or perspectives?
No, I just think that, there was a movie a while ago, The Lone Ranger, with Johnny Depp, that got panned by critics. But there was one pivotal moment in that movie where somebody had to decide whether or not they were going to embrace the truth of what they had done and the meaning of that, what it meant, or go along with the lie. And you saw it so clearly how much easier it was to go with the lie because it hurt to admit the truth and to really recognize what that meant, what that belief meant, that meant they massacred people indiscriminately without reason. And so I think that just recognizing that we all have those moments where we have to be open to a new meaning, a new way to look at things.
And that's a beautiful segue. It's a beautiful segue. And that's where we are as a people. And that's where we are as a people. So how do we do this? You see, we're at an impasse. We're at a true turning point in the history of the planet Earth. And so how do we find new ways? Now, I've read tons of sci-fi. I love science fiction. I love fantasy too, but science fiction was kind of my soul there for years and years. And what I loved about it was the imagination. And what I learned was the largest country in the whole universe was in the nation of Imagi, the imagination. And it's there. It's actually creating new worlds, even as it reinterprets the meaning of the world we live in. The more history I learn about what we did as a people to other people who we wanted to move aside, oh, it breaks my heart. From the concentration camps that we formed for Japanese people to the diphtheria blankets we gave to Native Americans. But our imagination can take us out of that place, can take us somewhere new. And I hope you'll join us for our next podcast as we dive into the imagination and as it reaches for a new world. God's peace, God's love, and in all things, may you be one with this love.